It's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Makkai. She is a Chicago-based author of the short story collection Music for Wartime, as well as the novels The 100-Year House, which was a book page Best Book of 2014 and a winner of the Chicago Writers Association Award, as well as The Borrower, which was on Booklist Top 10 debut. Her short fiction was featured in the Best American Short Stories Anthology in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, and after that, I'm sure still more, right? And it appears regularly in publications such as Harper's, Tin House, and on public radio's This American Life. She teaches at Northwestern University and runs Story Studio Chicago. Her newest book is called The Great Believers, and super excited to have her with us because it's nominated for a National Book Award. Like all of her writing, The Great Believers it's focused on characters, their complicated lives. It's written in a style and a voice that she is known for, this elegant prose, kind of cut with an edge of humor. It's a technically adept book. Her last book, The 100-Year House, is a great book. It's a ghost story, but it's told backwards. So you begin in the present time and you work back through generations to the creation of the ghost. And as well, The Great Believers has intertwining tales of 3 different time frames and kind of casts of characters. It's a deeply affecting story of loss of friends, loss of family, and how trauma can shape people and art can save them. And it's an ambitious book. It's wide in its arc. It made me cry a lot and smile too. And I was thinking about Veterans Day, just to kind of finish up, and you know how we honor these people who have sacrificed for their community and for our country. But I was also thinking about veterans in the sense of the book. There aren't traditional veterans who've gone off to fight, our foes and wars. But at the same time, in a broader context, there are veterans in this book, people who have survived the AIDS crisis, people who fought and struggled and sacrificed and who were shaped by this crisis. And Booklist, a reviewer, had said that these are intimately portrayed characters fighting painful pasts to find joy in the present. The book is a tribute to the enduring forces of love and art over everything. And I think in this time, and particularly on Veterans Day, I think honoring love and the power of art is a great thing to do. And Rebecca Makkai does it so well.
I'm going to read to you 3 different sections. The first one is the longest one, and then the others are quite a lot shorter. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what's going on, but also what was going on historically at the time, because I know a lot of you in the audience are younger. So The Great Believers is largely set in 1980s Chicago. It's set in the gay community there in an area of Chicago called Boys Town, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was the first officially recognized gay neighborhood in at least the US. I can't remember if it was the US or the world, but officially recognized by the city. And we're starting in 1985 here. So really quick background. AIDS was probably around through the 70s, but nobody knew about it. 1981 is when people started to put together. There was this article in the New York Times. They realized that 8 different men had died of this mysterious skin cancer that usually only older Jewish men got. These men weren't even Jewish. They were younger. They were all gay. Something was going on. By 1985, when this starts, we had more than 10,000 people dead in the US. At this point in time, there was no medication. The test for HIV, what we now call HIV, had just come out. But until that year, you would find out because you'd fall ill. And although there's a long incubation period for this disease, by the time these people got sick, they only had weeks or days to live often. So it was absolutely decimating. People were, if you lived in the thick of this community, which my characters do, you were losing many friends all at once in your early 20s or a little older. So that's what's going on with my characters. And at the same time, nationally, very little is being done. So Ronald Reagan was the president at this point. It's been, they're 4 years into this crisis, more than 10,000 people dead. He has not yet said the word AIDS in public. He is refusing to acknowledge that it even exists. There's a little bit of, medical spending on it, but hardly any. Really embarrassing looking back that France and England did most of the research and most of the stuff that helped because we weren't doing it. So that's the general background what's going on here. And the test for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, came out in 1985. I thought, and this is, I was alive in the 80s, but I was a kid. So this was a really research heavy book for me. And when I went in, my assumption was that people would have been thrilled when the test came out. Now you could find out whether you have it or not. Not the case for most people. This was a test that, first of all, you're testing for a disease that there's no cure for at this point. So do you really want to know? And then if you do know, is it actually going to make your behavior possibly more risky in some cases? People are just going to go out and get drunk and do stuff. Or are you going to think you're immune and that's going to be more risky? Or are you going to go kill yourself because you have it? There's that. There's also a question, can you even trust the test? Is it accurate? Then on top of it, there's all this fear of, can you trust the doctors giving the test? Can you trust that if the government came and subpoenaed the test results, asked for all the test results, would the doctors hand them over? And the reason people were really scared of that was that there were a lot of politicians out there wanting to do things like quarantine everyone with HIV on an island. There was one guy who wanted to do mandatory testing for everyone known to be gay, and if they had HIV, what he wanted was to brand them on the buttocks. So this is what's going on politically. So you can see, like, then to get tested, and is your doctor going to have those results? Could you be arrested? Could you be quarantined? Could you be sent away? What could happen to you? So people were not necessarily thrilled about this test. Some were getting tested and some weren't. Okay, so you're educated now, right? You're edumacated. I'm going to give you what's going on in here, which is that I have this one guy named Yale Tishman. He's in his early 30s. And when the story starts, I'm going to read you the end of the first chapter. So I'm going to catch you up to where we are. This is the memorial service for his friend Nico. And Nico is his first close friend to die of AIDS. Yale and his group of friends have been specifically left out of Nico's funeral. His family is having his funeral mass 20 miles away right now, and they have not been invited. Nico's partner has specifically not been invited, and his friends have not been invited, which was very common at that point. They are having their own memorial party at the house of their friend Richard. And Richard is an amateur photographer, and there's about to be a slideshow of Nico's life. And Yale is watching it, and he's not quite sure how he's going to handle it. And the only other things you need to know here, one is that Yale is the development director for a small art gallery at Northwestern University. He's getting paintings from people, getting money from people. The other thing you need to know is that they've been drinking Cuba Libres at the party, like rum and Coke, basically, because Nico was part Cuban. So that comes up later. All right. So the slideshow's starting here. Yale couldn't bear to join, and although he wouldn't be the only one crying, he didn't think he could stay here. He backed out of the crowd and took a few steps up Richard's stairs, watching the heads from above. The slides. Nico in running shorts, a number pinned to his chest. Nico and Terrence leaning against a tree, both giving the finger. Nico in profile with his orange scarf and black coat, a cigarette between his lips. Suddenly, there was Yale himself, tucked in the crook of Charlie's arm, Nico on the other side. The year-end party last December for Charlie's paper. Nico had been the graphic designer for Out Loud Chicago for Charlie's paper, and he'd had a regular comic strip there. And he'd just started designing theater sets, too, self-taught entirely. This was supposed to have been the prologue of his life. A new slide. Nico laughing at Julian and Teddy, the Halloween they had dressed as Sonny and Cher. Nico opening a present. Nico holding a bowl of chocolate ice cream. Nico up close, teeth shining. The last time Yale saw Nico, he'd been unconscious, with foam, some kind of awful white foam oozing suddenly from his mouth and nostrils. Terrence had screamed into the hallway for the nurses, had run into a cleaning cart and hurt his knee, and the fucking nurses were more concerned about whether or not Terrence had shed blood than about what was happening to Nico. And here on the slide was Nico's full, beautiful face, and it was too much. Yale dashed up the rest of the stairs. He worried the bedrooms would be full, but the first at least was empty. He closed the door and lay back on the bed to stare at the ceiling and do the slow breathing trick Charlie had taught him. All fall, he'd been memorizing the list of the gallery's regular donors. Tuning out the downstairs noise, he did what he often did at home when he couldn't sleep. He's named donors starting with A, then ones starting with B. Recently, he'd found the list disconcerting, had felt a dull gray uneasiness under it. He remembered being 7 and asking his father who else in the neighborhood was Jewish. Are the Rothmans Jewish? Are the Andersons? And his father rubbing his chin, saying, "Let's not do that, buddy. Historically, bad things happen when we make lists of Jews." It wasn't until years later that Yale realized this comment was a hang-up unique to his father, to his brand of self-hatred. But Yale had been young and impressionable, and maybe that's why this reciting of names chafed. Or no, maybe it was this. Lately, he'd had 2 parallel mental lists going, the donor list and the sick list. The people who might donate art or money, and the friends who might get sick. The big donors, the ones whose names you'd never forget, and the friends he'd already lost. But they weren't close friends, the lost ones, until tonight. They'd been acquaintances, friends of friends, like Nico's old roommate, Jonathan, a couple of gallery owners, 1 bartender, the bookstore guy. There were what, 6? 6 people he knew of, people he'd say hi to in a bar, people whose middle names he couldn't tell you, and maybe not even their last names. He'd been to 3 memorials, but now a new list, 1 close friend. Yale and Charlie had gone to an informational meeting last year with a speaker from San Francisco. He'd said, "I know guys who've lost no one, groups that haven't been touched, but I also know people who've lost 20 friends. Entire apartment buildings devastated." And the subtext here, just realized I should fill you in. AIDS really hit New York and San Francisco first, and LA a little bit. Cities like Chicago got hit very hard, but there was a little bit of lag time. It was maybe like a year later that things really hit the hardest there. And Yale, stupidly, desperately, had thought maybe he'd fall into that first category. It didn't help that through Charlie, he knew practically everyone in Boys Town. It didn't help that his friends were all overachievers, and that they seemed to be overachieving in this terrible new way as well. How had Yale forgotten that he hated rum? It always made him moody, dehydrated, hot, his stomach a mess. He found a closet-sized bathroom off this room and sat on the cool toilet, head between his knees. So I'm going to skip a little here because he sits there and thinks about stuff for a while, but it's nothing really relevant to what I'm reading to you right now. So we're skipping ahead. Just he's been there a while. And then there was the list of acquaintances already sick, waiting to get worse, or lying in the hospital, or flown home to dine near their parents, to be written up in their local papers as having died of pneumonia. Just a few right now, but there was room on that list. When Yale finally moved again, it was to cup water from the sink, splash it over his face. He looked frightful in the mirror, rings under his eyes, skin gone pale olive. His heart felt funny, but then his heart always felt funny. The slideshow must be over, and if he could look down in the crowd, he'd be able to spot Charlie. They could make their escape. He opened the door to the hall and heard a collective silence, as if they were all holding their breath, listening to someone make a speech. Only he couldn't quite hear the speech. He looked down, but there was no one in the living room. They'd moved somewhere. He came downstairs slowly, not wanting to be startled. A sudden noise would make him vomit. But down in the living room was just the whir of the record, spinning past the last song, the needle arm retired to the side. Beer bottles and Cuba Libre glasses, still half full, covered the tables and couch arms. The trays of canapes had been left on the dining table. Yale thought of a raid, some kind of police raid, but this was a private residence, and they were all adults, and nothing much illegal had happened. Probably someone had some pot, but come on. How long had he been upstairs? Maybe 20 minutes. He wondered if he could have fallen asleep on the bed, if it was 2 a.m. now. But no, not unless his watch had stopped. It was only 5:45. He was being ridiculous, and they were out in the backyard. Places like this had backyards. He walked through the empty kitchen, through a book-lined den. There was the door, but it was dead-bolted. He cupped his hand to the glass. A striped canopy, a heap of dead leaves, the moon. No people. Yale turned and started shouting. "Hello? Richard? Guys? Hello?" He went to the front door, also bizarrely dead-bolted, and fumbled till it opened. There was no one on the dark street. The foggy, ridiculous idea came to him that the world had ended, that some apocalypse had swept through and forgotten only him. He laughed at himself, but at the same time, he saw no bobbing heads in neighbors' windows. There were lights in the houses opposite, but then the lights were on here too. At the end of the block, the traffic signal turned from green to yellow to red. He hoped for a siren, a horn, a dog, an airplane across the night sky. Nothing. He went back inside and closed the door. He yelled again, "You guys!" And he felt now that a trick was being played, that they might jump out and laugh. But this was a memorial, wasn't it? It wasn't the 10th grade. People weren't always looking for ways to hurt him. He found his own reflection in Richard's TV. He was still here, still visible. On the back of a chair was a blue windbreaker he recognized as Asher glasses. The pockets were empty. He should leave, but where would he even go? Cigarette butts filled the ashtrays. None were half-smoked, none smashed out in haste. He walked through every room on the ground floor, opened every door, pantry, coat closet, vacuum closet, until he was greeted with a wall of cold air and descending cement steps. He found the light switch and made his way down. Laundry machines, boxes, 2 rusty bikes. He climbed back up and then all the way to the 3rd floor, a study, a little weight room, some storage, and then down to the 2nd again and opened everything. A master bedroom, all white and green. A Diane Arbus print on the wall, the one of the boy with the hand grenade. A telephone sat next to Richard's bed, and Yale grabbed it with relief. He listened to the tone, reassuring, and slowly dialed his own number. No answer. He needed to hear a voice, any human voice, and so he got the dial tone back and called information. "Name and city, please," the woman said. "Hello?" He wanted to make sure she wasn't a recording. "This is information. Do you know the name of the person you wish to call?" "Yes, it's Marcus, Nico Marcus on North Clark in Chicago." He spelled the names. "I have an N Marcus on North Clark. Would you like me to connect you?" No, thank you." "Stay on the line for the number." Yale hung up. He circled the house one more time and went finally to the front door. He called to no one, "I'm leaving, I'm going," and stepped out into the dark. Okay, so the fact that there are 300 more pages should tell you that the world has not ended. Big spoiler here. I was reading that once, and before it was published, actually, to a group like this, and a young woman came up to me afterwards, very excited because she thought I was writing sci-fi. And she thought they'd been spirited away by aliens. That's not what's happened. I won't tell you what's happened because I have to trick you into buying the book somehow. But okay. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to skip ahead. And there's one slight spoiler in here for anyone who's planning to read the book, but it's not shocker. It's weird. I'm reading to you from like page 264, but there's not that much more that you need to know at this point. One thing you need to know is that Yale by now is living in a different part of the city. He's living, if any of you guys know Chicago at all, or if you know the band Wilco, and you know their album cover that has these 2 kind of corncob-shaped towers. Okay, those are called the Marina Towers, and they're right by the river, almost downtown in Chicago. And Yale is living in one of those. They're these cool. Every apartment in there is shaped like a pizza slice. They're really wild. They're built in the '60s, very mod. Anyway, he's living in one of those, and he has a friend named Julian, and the spoiler in this, that this is something you wouldn't find out until partway through, is that Julian does take the test and Julian does have HIV, and doesn't know how far, when he got it, he thinks he knows when he got it, he thinks he's going to get sick soon. And Julian has kind of fallen off the deep end. He used to have this beautiful hair. He's shaved his head. He's been out every night. Partying is the wrong word because it's really depressing what he's doing. And Yale's run into him at the grocery store. And Julian basically says, "Take me home with you. I need a place to hide out." He's trying to kind of escape from his ex boyfriend, and he wants to leave the country. He wants to go to Puerto Rico first and then somewhere out of the country and die alone, away from everybody else. And Yale doesn't think that's a great plan, but he's nevertheless brought Julian home. And this apartment does not belong to Yale. At the very end, you'll hear something. It belongs to some friends of his whose name is a couple named the Sharps. Okay. The one thing, Julian was an actor, and he was very good looking. And the rumor, at least among this group of friends, was that Julian used to play Prince Charming at Disney World. That, like the people who walk around or whatever. That's the rumor, at least. Okay. All right. And this is a little bit shorter section, and then I'm going to read you a very short section. Then we'll do some Q&A, so you guys can be thinking about questions. They ate pizza and drank beer at the dining table and turned off the lights so they could look out the windows at the city. Julian said, "This is like the Jetsons, like a flying car should pick you up outside your window." It had been nearly 2 weeks since Julian had shaved his head, and at least you couldn't see white patches anymore. Still, it was all wrong. His ears stuck out. His forehead looked broad and pale. Yale said, "I want you to know I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at Charlie, and I'm mad at the world, and I'm mad at the government, but you're hard to be mad at." I'm not going to, too much of a spoiler about what he's talking about. He's just mad. He should be mad at Julian. "It's because I'm so pathetic." No, really it is. I've learned this recently. When you're a sad sack of shit, no one feels anything for you but pity. "I don't think you're pathetic," Yale said. "Just wait till I weigh 80 pounds. I mean, you won't ever see that because I'll be gone. That's my point. I hate being pitied. I wish you'd just be mad at me. I wish you'd kick me in the head. No one's willing to be mad at me but God." "For Christ's sake," Yale said, "you can stay over, but Jerry Falwell can't, okay?" Anyone young enough, Jerry Falwell is just a horrible man. I'll just leave it at that. Going on TV, saying it was the wrath of God, that AIDS was the wrath of God. "I can't shake the feeling that God chased me up here from Georgia. I tried to make my life perfect, and I came up here and everything was beautiful. It was so good, and I should have known. I should have been waiting for this." "I understand, but you're internalizing a lot of bullshit." "Did I ever tell you about Disney World? Not when I worked there, the first time I went there." Yale said no, got them more beer. "They have this thing called grad night, where they keep the park open all night long for kids about to graduate high school. And Valdosta's right across the border, so the Parents Association got us buses and bought us all tickets. You could go on any rides, no lines, and there were bands playing. You just had to stay awake all night. Everyone had a flask. And at first I was sticking with my friends, all these theater girls who thought they were going to marry me. And then I start noticing these 3 guys from some other school. So beautiful and so gay, like dripping with gay, which wasn't something I'd really seen in Georgia. We're waiting behind them in line for Space Mountain, and one of them, this kid with an earring, starts talking to me and says they're getting food next. Do I want food? So by the time we get off the ride, I'm following these guys, eating ice cream with them, and my friends are gone. And the guy with the earring wants us to do the people mover. It's not even a ride, really. It's like you go in this little box along an elevated track, but slow. So his friends go in one car, and he and I go in the next one, even though we could have squeezed together. And at this point in my life, just being in the same space as this guy is the most thrilling thing I've ever done. I'm terrified. So the ride goes through some buildings, and at one point it goes into the dark, and it's only supposed to be a few seconds, but the ride gets stuck there in the dark. Yale wasn't sure if the story was about to turn pornographic or romantic or terrible, so he just said, "Oh God," which covered all 3 possibilities. "What did you do?" "Nothing." The kid got down on his knees and unzipped my fly and sucked me off. It was the most amazing 2 minutes of my life. I mean, I was terrified they would turn on the lights, but I didn't really have much mental space for that. The ride started moving again like half a second after I zipped back up. That's, wow. Well, yeah. And my takeaway from the whole thing, besides the fact that I was definitely gay, was that there were good places and bad places in the world. Disney World was a good place, and Valdosta was a bad place. And I had to get back to Disney as fast as I could, which I did. And then after a couple years, it was about getting to a real city. So I tried Atlanta. And then it was about getting out of the South, getting to a bigger city, a bigger theater scene. Like the more steps I took away from Valdosta, the safer I'd be. It was a ladder that just went up and up, right? And it ended in some kind of mansion in San Francisco. But look at me. I feel like such an idiot that I ever thought I could have a really good life. Yale said, "You'll have a better life if you stay here than if you go. You need to stay where people love you. Aren't you falling into the same trap again, thinking there's some better place out there?" I mean, there are warmer places, I'll say that. If I'm going to die, I want to die with the sun shining on my face. Fair enough. Yale made sure Julian had towels in the master bathroom. He imagined the Sharps coming home next month to find an entire 58th floor refugee camp of the recently diagnosed. Sleeping bags and cots, vitamins and protein shakes. Okay, so before I read you one last section, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research I did into this novel, which might then lead to some questions if you guys want to talk about that. This book did not start off really being about the AIDS crisis. It started off with what's now a subplot about, I mentioned that Yale is a gallery, works at an art gallery, and it originally started with the story of this woman who was donating art to the museum and her life as an artist model in 1920s Paris. Here's what happened, actually. I had this idea that I wanted to write this story about this woman who had been an artist model, and she's old, and this painting comes up for auction, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's really by this famous artist or not. And she's watching the news, and she sees it, and she knows who painted it because that's her in the painting, and she has to convince people that it's real. And then she was going to be like talking to this art guy about that, and I fortunately mentioned that to my husband. I was like, "This is what I'm thinking of writing," and he was like, honey, that's the plot of the movie Titanic. Um, that thing where she sees this, like the sketch comes up on the news and she's like, "It's me. It was 84 years ago." So I was like, "Oh, shoot. I have to really rethink this." And so I thought, I was like, maybe it's going to be a little bit more about the art guy. It was already going to be the 80s because that was the time that she could have lived to, just mathematically. So I have an art guy in the 80s, started to research the AIDS epidemic, thinking that would be part of the story. And very soon it really took over the story. It really became what I wanted to write about. As I was looking at this, though, one thing that I realized was that when you look at the books that chronicle the whole AIDS epidemic, they are really mostly about New York, San Francisco, maybe Paris and London, where some research was going on. Chicago wasn't even in the index of those books, but I figured that there would be other books. I figured that there would be some nonfiction accounts of how AIDS hit America's third largest city, right? Really hit hard in Chicago. There were 0 books devoted to AIDS in Chicago. There were some bigger, coffee table books like, Out and Proud in the Windy City, 1822 to the present, and you have 10 pages in there. So there was some information, but there were 0 books, which I found shocking. I have not written that book. I've written a novel. So I did not go, "I shall write the book." It was more just, this is appalling that there isn't that much out there. But it forced me, it was a blessing in disguise for my book, even as it's alarming in other ways, because it forced me to go out and do much more direct research right away. So I went to the library downtown and I read every back issue of this one gay weekly called the Windy City Times from 1985 to 1992, every issue. It's really interesting. And I also did a lot of one-on-one interviews with people. I reached out and people connected me to other people, and soon I was interviewing doctors, nurses, lawyers, activists, historians, journalists, and just survivors. Um, and those people, they brought so much to the book for me because it wasn't just factual research, it was emotional research, sitting across from someone and crying with them and hearing their stories, looking at their photographs. Um, and the very short scene I'm about to read you was really inspired particularly by one specific conversation that I had with someone. I'm going to tell you about it after I read this section and right before we do some Q&A. But what you need to know for this section is that although most of the book is 1980s Chicago, every other chapter, and they're shorter chapters, are set in 2015 Paris. Nico, whose memorial service we saw at the beginning, had a little sister, and her name is Fiona. She was 21 in the 80s. She's in her 50s now. And long story about why she's in Paris. She's tracking down her estranged daughter who disappeared into a cult. Not really relevant right now, but if you like cults, there are cults in this book. And she's staying, the guy whose house it was at the beginning, Richard, we knew him as an amateur photographer back then. Now he's very famous as a photographer, and famous in large part for having chronicled the AIDS epidemic. And he lives in Paris, and she's staying with him. And the day she got there, he tried to show her all these photo albums of her brother and his friends back in the day, but she wasn't ready to look at them yet. And they're just snapshots, but she's ready now for the first time. So I'm going to read to you part of a very short part of this section. Oh, and the other thing about Fiona, she, in adult life, her job is that she runs a resale shop in Chicago that benefits AIDS housing. So she's stayed involved in that activism and stuff as an adult. Okay. Do you guys know the movie Philadelphia with Tom Hanks? You guys know what it is? Some people are nodding. It was kind of it was the first big Hollywood movie about AIDS, but and it was probably what they needed to do at the time. But of course, they cast a straight guy as their main character. They cast Tom Hanks as playing this gay guy, and it's very schmaltzy Hollywood. But it was kind of the one thing that some people absorbed. You need to know that for this. Okay. There were probably 20 albums on the shelf, a fact Fiona hadn't absorbed that first day. Rows of black leather, brown leather, colored canvas, boxes full of slides as well, but she wouldn't mess with those. When she pulled a thick red album off the shelf, though, a paper slipped out and landed on the floor. Fiona attempted to clutch the album closed before anything else fell, but she dropped the whole thing, and now there were papers everywhere. Cream-colored sheets folded in half, small cards, a lavender page with a grainy photo of a man. They were funeral bulletins and prayer cards. She got on her knees and started stacking them up. This wasn't a photo album at all, she saw, when she opened it to an old clipping from Out Loud Chicago, an obituary of someone who'd danced with the Alvin Ailey Theater. Jesus. She opened the album at the beginning and tried to slide the papers back into the empty spots. A man named Oscar, no one she remembered, had died in 1984. A clipping about Katsu Tatami from 1986. Here was the bulletin for Terrence Robinson, Nico's Terrence. How odd. She must have put this bulletin together herself, but she didn't remember it. Jonathan Byrd, Dwight Sumner. There were so impossibly many. In her current life, it happened at least once a week that someone would wander into the store. And then, when they discovered its mission, say something like, "Oh, I remember that time." Fiona had learned to check her temper, to push her toes into the floor so her face didn't change. "I knew someone whose cousin had it," they'd continue. "Did you ever see Philadelphia?" And they'd shake their heads in dismay. And how could she answer? They meant well, all of them. How could she explain that this city was a graveyard? That they were walking every day through streets where there had been a Holocaust, a mass murder of neglect and antipathy? That when they stepped through a pocket of cold air, didn't they understand it was a ghost? It was a boy the world had spat out. Here in her hand, a stack of ghosts. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you about that before we do some chatting is that one of the guys that I interviewed, he was this incredible person. I'd been reading about him as I looked at these newspapers back in the day. He was really big in ACT UP, which was the biggest AIDS advocacy action group. They did a lot of direct action kind of protests, a lot of marching in the streets. And I'd been seeing video of this guy, reading about him. And I wasn't even sure, as I start, you watch this, you're not sure who's still alive and who's not. So I was really, and very often they weren't. I was so delighted when I learned he was still alive. And then someone volunteered to introduce me to him. which just, it was weird. It was like you'd been doing research on the Revolutionary War, and Paul Revere is willing to have coffee with you and chat with you about it, right? Like, it just stepped out of a history book for me. But so I'm meeting with this guy, and we're meeting at a kind of a corner stall in a bar, and he had brought photo albums with him. And photo albums for me were absolute gold in my research. First of all, we're talking about a time when not every human had a camera on them at all moments, right? So just fewer photos in general. Secondly, you don't take a camera into a gay bar in 1985. That's not cool. So far fewer pictures of this particular community. And also, you're not going to take as many photos of your emaciated, dying friends, right? Their photos might have fallen by the wayside. So the fact that he had photo albums, I was really excited. And we looked through one album, um, and then he opened the other, and this exact thing happened. These papers flew everywhere. And he realized that it was he had not realized when he grabbed it off the shelf that it was a scrapbook. It was full of funeral bulletins. And the reason that they were all shoved in there so quickly, this is something I didn't get a chance to put in the novel because it wasn't in the right time period. It wasn't in the city I was writing about. But I like to tell this story when I'm out on the road with this because it's an example of the way that the stories of other cities need to be told and maybe haven't been told. That wherever you live around here, there are stories there too about what happened. But the reason that these bulletins were all shoved in there is that this guy, although he lived in Chicago, he was from Milwaukee. And what happened in Milwaukee is that in 1993, there was an outbreak in the water of this bacteria called cryptosporidium. And dozens of people died. And I remember I was in high school at the time. I remember hearing about it on the news. And what you heard on the news was it's generally affecting the elderly and people with compromised immunity. What that meant was everyone living with HIV in the city of Milwaukee died within about a week of each other. So this is late enough, 1993, there was some good medication out there. These people were doing okay. And if they'd lasted just another 3 years, they would have made it to the time when there was really good medication, and they probably would still be here. But they just all were affected at once. So this guy had gone to a week's worth of funerals. And this was at a time when the friends were dying more slowly. It wasn't right. He wasn't using the scrapbook that much anymore. He said he just went up and spent the week in Milwaukee doing nothing but going to funerals. And he came back and he had all these bulletins and he just shoved them in there and really didn't look at it again because that was towards the end of the funerals for him. So I needed to write that in some way, just that scene into my book. If not, I don't mention Milwaukee in here because I'm not in the 90s. It's the wrong city. But the way that those meetings that I had with people, that was the kind of research that I couldn't have gotten from a book, that really had to come from sitting down with someone and having a conversation with them. So I would love to chat with you about writing, researching this book, other books, life, publishing, any of those things. But the thing is, it always takes one person to ask the first question. And then after someone asks the first question, usually we get a conversation going.